Alrighty, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this month's Coffee Night Chat. Our team at Pflag Canada, York Region, affirm that we are all treaty people and acknowledge that our organization serves the lands of two treaties. These treaties are signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the First Nations of the Williams Treaty. For the Mississaugas of Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Scugog Island, and the Chippewas of Beau Soleil, Brahma, and Georgina Island, our closest neighbor. To honor this agreement, we all take up responsibility to be respectful of their traditions, knowledges, and inherent rights as sovereign nations. We will respect their relationship with these lands and recognize that our connection to this land is through the continued relationship with these First Nations, and we acknowledge our shared responsibility to respect and care for the land and waters for future generations. And with all of our events, we try to empower you all to share in that responsibility and to be respectful of one another and to care for one another through our support meetings and to become inspired by events like tonight with our Coffee Night Chats. And I'm sure tonight in this event will be no exception as we observe the Day of Pink here in Canada, and we welcome Reverend Dr. Cheri DiNovo. So Cheri is a career activist whose work has led them through the United Church of Canada and as a member of Provincial Parliament in Ontario. Everything Cheri's done has been through the lens of helping others and promoting equity for many marginalized communities, like the LGBTQ2 community, folks experiencing housing security, people who use substances, and many more. Early in her career, she focused her work was in placing women in high-profile jobs as her role as a recruiter. And later, she earned her Masters of Divinity in 1995 and later a doctorate in ministry from the University of Toronto in 2002. In her political career, she's known as the Queen of Tri-Party Bills, and we love a good queen here at Pflag, and is commonly recognized as the MPP who passed more private members' bills than anyone in Ontario history. And that includes acts which affirm and protect LGBTQ2 folks. Cheri is a recipient of the Order of Canada, a distinction which recognizes extraordinary contributions to Canadian society. Cheri recently published a memoir titled The Queer Evangelist, and it's available through many bookstores, but we highly recommend you check out Glad Day Bookstore to obtain your copies there. Currently, Cheri hosts a radio show, The Radical Reverend, on 89.5 CIUT FM on Tuesdays at 11 a.m., and it's available on any podcast platform as well. And she's also a minister at the Trinity-St. Paul's United Church and Center for Faith, Justice, and the Arts. That was a long intro, but well-deserved because you've done so much for our community, Cheri. Welcome.
Thanks, Tristan. Actually, the most salient for Pflag folk will be that I did the first legalized same-sex marriage in Canada and passed more queer bills than anybody in Canadian history. So the first banning conversion therapy, and that was in 2015 before the federal government picked it up in Ontario. The first trans rights bill, which was 2012 of any major jurisdiction in North America. So, and of course, you never do these things alone. It's always with a credible support of a lot of great activists. So, but I just want to highlight those because Day of Pink, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. And the story behind that first same-sex marriage I find is so fascinating from reading your book. That it was obviously before male, female, female, and gender roles were on those marriage certificates, and you just kind of signed two women up, and there was no questions asked, and lo and behold, you were able to perform the ceremony.
Yeah, well, we did it by bands. So we read it out. And it was an alternative. If Pella and Blank had gone to City Hall, they would have said no, they just turned them away. But on the bands form, it just said bride and groom. It didn't say anything about male and female. So we just filled in the blanks. We read it, had to read it out in church a couple of weeks in a row. Nobody objects. It's an ancient method, right? And then sent it in, and with a wing and a prayer. And luckily, a clerk in the registrar's office thought that Paula was a man's name and vetted it. So then, of course, all glorious hell broke loose because then the Toronto Star picked it up, and Yeah, the church, even though the church has been, the United Church has been ordaining openly gay and lesbian folks since 1988, church didn't really get behind, the larger church. Our congregation were cool. So I said I did what any good Christian would do, got a good lawyer, Doug Elliott, who fought for equal rights, and called the CBC. And so it kind of blew up. And then for Paula and Blanca's sake, in a year, the Ontario Supreme Court said that this was unconstitutional. Great. They managed to keep their license. Meanwhile, they threatened to take away mine. So it was a little dicey there for a minute, but I herald, some really great people in the congregation and all those that worked to make that happen. That was in 2001. It's over 20 years ago. Think about it. Wow. Anyway, go on.
Well, thank you for that, and just for all the work that you've done, and we'll get into all of that very shortly. But as a little bit of icebreaker, and for the folks who are attending, just to get to know you a little bit, we're gonna kind of throw some rapid fire questions at you. Very, very random questions. So let's get things going there. And firstly, sunrise or sunset? Sunrise or sunset? What do you prefer? Oh, that's for you, Cheri. That's
going to be for me. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. I was not.
Chat.
I definitely was not. Well, if people want to respond in the chat too, that's okay. But clearly, I was not clear about that. Sorry. So don't worry about that.
Yeah, I'm like an early bird. I'm like a sunrise person. I have to say. I know that's weird, but I like a good sunrise. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to be a morning person, but I'm not a morning person. I really desperately want to be a morning, but I can't do it. How do you start your day?
Coffee, get up, coffee, probably get immediately online, to see emails, social, all of that jazz. So it's a pretty typical morning for, I think, most people in the world, quite frankly. Yeah.
And what's your favorite color?
I want to say red, but lately I'm a little muted. Like, I actually like pink, even though I don't have much that's pink, right? I don't know that I have probably black. Most of the things I have are black. Is that a color? I don't know.
That is a color. That's okay.
There you
go. TV, film, or books?
Film, I would say. But watched on TV because like COVID. So like who went to movies? But yeah, I like a good movie. Although I binge watch like everybody else has during COVID, whatever Netflix throws at me. So yeah.
Well, what's your latest binge on Netflix?
Oh, what did I last watch? Good question. I'm just kind of halfway through that one on what's her name, Anna. The fraudster in New York who pretended she was a German heiress, and anyway, mainly for the clothes. But yeah, and talking about clothes, I should say that I wear a collar when I do things like this because just because, a couple of reasons. First of all, it took women hundreds of years to be able to do this, wear one, but also because when I first was ordained, I was walking down the street in Toronto, this lovely old man came up to me and said, "Good afternoon, Father." So I think as long as I get that response, it's a pretty non-binary statement. So yeah, I like playing with gender roles here. Yeah.
What's the last song you played?
It was, I was like doing like at home, running around the place. I think it was Rage Against the Machine. Like it was one of the, like, remember them? I'm old, but it was a Rage Against the Machine, something that get my heartbeat going. So yeah.
Who is your hero?
There's so many, right? Like, it's really hard to narrow it down. The best preacher, Martin Luther King, obviously. Like, I think of categories of greatness, but I think, is it Marsha P? Like, the trans woman who started Stonewall, we've just kind of found out about her, right? Like, she was never in any history books. And now we're kind of getting getting to know her. So I'm all about kind of her story as well as, everybody else, as well as male story, So yeah, I'm kind of consciously looking more and more at women. Bell Hooks just died, great poet, great writer, and especially women of color. So I think we have to be conscious about this now.
Finish the phrase. The way to my heart is
good glass of red wine.
You
can get farther than the heart with that, friend.
I've never really liked wine before, and I kind of just started getting into red wine. It pairs so well with what I usually snack on. Well, cheese. So
yeah.
And lastly, what's the best thing to happen to you this month?
Best thing, well, actually, the best thing that happened to me this month was just the other day, and this is part of ministry, but it was pretty beautiful. I got this call from someone that I vaguely remember him from about 24 years ago in my church back then. I've been ordained for 27 years. And he was part of our evening service, which were mainly people with mental health and addiction issues, which is where a lot of queers came in, including Toby Dancer. Tobys Law, trans rights law was named after Toby. Anyway, he was one of those folk and came out of prison, had a really troubled past. And he phoned me up to thank me just for being there, like out of the blue, 25 years later. And I thought, it's one of those beautiful spiritual moments that, I said, well, yeah, well, thank you for thanking me. Really, like his gift to me was far greater than anything I could do. I really just listened. And he needed somebody to listen to him. So yeah, that was the greatest thing that's happened to me recently.
That's a fitting anecdote for Day of Pink, I think, because that's just one example of many examples of allyship and just being there for someone who might be going through a situation, whether it's bullying or whether it's anything else. That's a really wonderful story. All right, well, I'm going to flip over the stage to you to share a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your journey. There's so much to talk about, but we want to keep it punchy. We're going to have you share for about 20 minutes or so, and then of course, as always for everyone, the Q&A is open, the chat is open. We'll likely go to the Q&A after words, and but feel free to share your thoughts in between and to use the Q&A. And Cheri, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'll start with this little picture. I'll get out of her way. So this is me at 15. I always say our family, the women in my family age into blonde. So I've aged into blonde. But that was me at 15 when I left home. So I grew up in downtown Toronto on Bedford Road, which wasn't Shishi back then, but was my parents ran a rooming house. It was a very violent home, very strange, and not safe for a kid. And also I knew I was queer. So there was lots going on in that little head. But I left, and look at me, I looked like I was 12. I mean, for any parents out there who have kids, this will give you nightmares, but I survived, yay. And there's no legal way of making a living for a 15-year-old. So there were two options for a girl, and I chose getting involved in drugs. So I was drug involved and sold and bought. And I guess that's my first intro to the Bible. I tell the story often, but I imported LSD and hollowed out Bibles from the States. So I wasn't raised with really any religion in the household. So that was me as a young queer person. And then I'm going to jump to what is the cover of my book, Broken Up. And that's me there. In the middle, and that's the first gay pride picnic in Toronto. That was in 1971. So there we are celebrating. And actually one of the guys behind me was a crime writer. He's still around in the village, James Dubrow. and wrote columns for the Star and wrote books and stuff. But yeah, so that was us then. So this is just a little bit of where I came from. I got back to school with the help of some really good adults who looked out for, us kids. And also because I was able to live back then on what they call student welfare. Now it would be Ontario Works. And back then on welfare, you could afford to rent a basement apartment and feed yourself and go to school. So I went back to school at 19, and imagine that. I mean, you couldn't do that. So that's why we see more kids on the street now. Very simple. We don't allow people to get out of poverty on social assistance. I'm going to move along now, from there to jumping right ahead into ministry. And one of the first things I did was open up our evening service to those who had mental health and addiction issues at my church, which had 2 years to close, by the way. It was on Roncesvalles in the west end of Toronto, then called Emmanuel Howard Park, now Roncesvalles. And that's where I did the first legalized same-sex wedding. And these are the two women. This is us at Pride. So Paula and Blanca got married, one Venezuelan, one Colombian. And that came out and grew out of the evening service that we started. A lot of street involved folk came in, a lot of trans folk came in, and one of the trans folk who came in was this person. This isn't a very good picture, but this is Toby Dancer. This is the stained glass window that was made of Toby when she died and was put up in our sanctuary. And Toby came into the evening service mainly to eat, had very toxic religious background, like a lot of queer folk. And we didn't have enough money to have a piano player or anything in the evening service at that point. So we used to jokingly sing Acapulco, as we called it. And Toby, turns out that Toby in her past life as a man was one of the top musicians in Canada and actually produced Ian Tyson albums. So Toby one night offered to play for us and eventually became the music director for the entire church evening service and morning service. And when Toby died of an overdose, broke our hearts, everyone in the congregation and in the community. And so some folk came together to put the stained glass window in the sanctuary, which has become a kind of pilgrimage site for trans and non-binary folk. And that's why the bill to add trans rights to the Ontario Human Rights Code was called Tobys Law. So that's Toby. And then coming out of all of this, I wrote my first book, which is Queer Evangelism. And that was my doctoral thesis at University of Toronto, but I Americanized it because it's published out of UCLA, out of their LGBTQ institute there. And it was really about how we kept that church alive and in fact grew it by being inclusive, by being welcoming to queer folk. And remember, this is in the 90s still. So including the first legalized same-sex marriage. So now the book's out of print, but it's going to, my publisher is bringing it back on in an electronic version because I want it to be accessible to everybody. That will be happening in the next few months, in the spring sometime. But if anybody wants a copy, I think Glad Day still has one or two, and I've got a few that I can happily give you. They're collector's items now. Anyway, that won the Lambda Award in Washington, D.C. for spirituality and religion. And here's a nice little picture of me getting that award. Lambda Awards are given, they're queer awards given for queer authors in a whole range of genres. And that was amazing. Like, I didn't even know I was nominated. And then when I heard I was nominated, I thought, oh, let's go down to Washington. It'll be fun. Had no idea I was going to win. So that was pretty exciting stuff. And again, the whole point of the book was to show that you could be a person of faith, you could be religious and still queer positive. And in fact, that churches, the United Church of Canada, started ordaining openly gay and lesbian folk, which is the reason I walked in 1988. And many people left the church, and I wanted to show that people would come to a church that welcomed them and still does at Trinity-St. Paul's. So I'd say our growing edge of new members are queer folk, even today. So there's that. Let me just quickly run through a couple of things here before I get to politics, but very quickly, texts of terror in the Bible, because people will always ask about that. Here's Sodom and Gomorrah, from which we get the term sodomite, and it's actually a queer positive story. So just so you know, if somebody throws this at you, because people are still throwing it at me every month or so, I get a call or an email from somebody who says they're Christian, who says, yeah, but what about Sodom and Gomorrah? What about the other texts of terror, as we call them? So the story is that two angels are sent by God into this town to test whether they're hospitable or not. And there's something strange about the angels. They're strangers, but they're strange in a kind of way, because the response of the men in the village isn't to kill them or attack them or sell them as slaves or put them in prison. The response is to rape them, to gather together to gang rape them. Lot, who's the kind of erstwhile anti-hero, hero of the story, says, no, leave them alone. Take my virgin daughters instead. And then when Lot and his wife flee the town as it's burnt up to the ground because they didn't welcome the strange people, the queer people, Lot then proceeds to have incest with his daughters. Now, if this is a tale about sexual morality, it's a pretty freaking strange tale of sexual morality, because it supports incest and gang rape only if it's women. So it's not a story about that. It's a story about hospitality to those that are different from us. So just very quickly, I'm giving you some ammo here when Christians come at you, because sometimes they do, or so-called Christians. And the other one is just this. This is the very first Christian convert in Acts, this person being baptized here. And guess what? This is a eunuch. Now, eunuchs were, yes, sometimes forcibly castrated, but in Jesus says in Matthew 19:12, don't believe me, check it out, 2,000 years before Lady Gaga, some are born that way. He talks about eunuchs, and he says people who aren't interested in marriage, and some are born that way. So here is a eunuch. Philip, the disciple, wasn't even going to touch the eunuch because the eunuch was considered, guess what, sexually unclean. The eunuch convinced Philip to baptize them because they quoted scripture accurately to Philip. So there you go. First was a BIPOC person, first new convert, and a queer BIPOC person in the New Testament. So there's a little bit of ammo for you that you can use in cocktail parties or wherever you are. And then what happened? Then I got elected. Now, why would I do such a crazy thing as that? Well, first of all, I never aspired to that. Clearly, I've always been a social justice, person, but I never, aspired to that. My MP at that time, Peggy Nash, asked me if I'd consider running provincially, and I'd never even thought about it. So after some deliberation and a few months and talking to a few people, the two quotes that I always like to tell are, one congregant said, well, Cheri, I wouldn't wish that job on my worst enemy, but I think you should go for it. And the other person said to me, being asked to run for a political party is like being asked to the, prom by the high school quarterback. I mean, it's flattering, but then you have to spend the evening with a football player. So there you go. And by the way, I just noticed that right behind me over here is Cindy Bourgeois, the first who came through our congregation, who came in not as herself and left as herself. The first openly trans woman to ever be ordained that we're aware of. Others have come out after ordination. So she's the first, and she's actually going to be in ministry in West Hill in Ontario very soon. So yes, so I got elected, and all sorts of exciting things happened after that. I got to meet interesting people like this guy here. But mainly and mostly what was exciting was to be able to, one of the first bills that I put in was Tobys Law to add trans rights to the Ontario Human Rights Code, got pushback from everybody. I introduced that bill 5 times before we finally got it made law. Then, as I said before, banning conversion therapy, that was 2015. Equal parenting, that came in. And finally, my last bill that I managed to get passed was the Trans Day of Remembrance, which demands that just before question period, everybody in the House rises and has a moment of silence for all of those trans folk who've died through violence, either their own or others in last year, and it's always hundreds. So that was the last bill. And guess what? Even after Doug Ford got elected before COVID and we were allowed in the building, I went back for that moment of silence and with a lot of activists, and they still honored it. It's the law because I got one of the conservatives to sign on, which is one of the reasons why I did that. So getting working your way across the aisle, talking to people who aren't ideologically, as where you're at, is always a good thing to do and always important. So that's a little lesson from there. This is like the whirlwind tour. So I really suggest that you read the book to get the whole story here. Basically, I'll leave you with this image because it's not only Pink Shirt Day, it's also Black History Month, but I love this image. So there you go. That shifts the way we think about deity, doesn't it? And creation. So maybe I'll go back to the book itself, another background there, and we can get the discussion going because I'm really interested in what you are interested in, what you have to say. So where are you at and what do you think? And by the way, the reason I wrote this book, and I should just say this before I throw the floor to you, is hope. Because in 1971, I was the only woman to sign on to We Demand, which was the first gay, quotes unquote, demonstration on Parliament Hill. And we were just a gang of utopian hippies, really. And the things we were asking for, we never thought we would see, mainly in our lifetimes. We didn't think, yes, we were no longer criminal, but we couldn't marry, we got fired, we didn't have to be hired. We didn't even know much about trans rights back then. So there was all sorts of ways in which we were not equal. We couldn't keep our children if we separated, etc. Certainly couldn't adopt. And every single one of those asks, we won. We won. You and we won. We won them over the years. So 50 years, we won everything. So I wrote the story as a story of hope that, even if you're a backbencher in a third party, which I was, you can get laws changed. Even if you're, a kid on the streets, you can change laws. This is really an important message because it's really easy to be cynical, right? It's really easy to feel like when you're trying to change the system, you're banging your head against the wall and your head will go and the wall will remain. And so I'm living proof that that is not the case. And particularly where queer rights are concerned, we are now a beacon really in the world in Ontario in terms of what we've accomplished. Not alone, it's not ever alone, but we've done this. So give yourselves a kiss. And I'll throw the floor to you.
Thank you so much. And I know it's a whirlwind, but I highly recommend that everyone read Cheri's book. I got a copy myself and I've read through it, and it's such an incredible journey, and it's so inspiring. Even like growing up, I remember watching, when I was in high school, just the first same-sex marriage that became, not the first same-sex marriage, but watching the federal legislation get passed on CPAC. And then as I kind of read about it, at the same time, I was actually doing an essay on same-sex marriage in my law class in high school. And in some of my research and looking at the papers, I came across the marriage that you did. And I had mentioned that in my essay, just on a personal level. So this is kind of a bit of a full circle moment for me that I'm kind of giddy over myself.
Well, it works both ways.
We do have a question in, and I encourage everyone to share their questions either in the Q&A or the chat. We're looking at both. An interesting question here. How was the process of writing and editing the book, and was it with the publishing company?
Sure. So it's Wilfrid Laurier Press. You can see that in the corner here. And they actually, I was already writing it. In fact, I'd almost written it when they came to me and they said they wanted to re-release Queer Evangelism, which they're doing this spring. But they said, what we're really interested in is a memoir. Do you have would you write a memoir? I said, funny you should ask. So it was serendipity for sure. So that's how it started. I was lucky that way. And then it was a real process to get it finally to print. It's always a process, One thing I learned from university presses, though, and this is no disparagement to, UCLA, but I mean, what's really important is not so much getting your book published, it's distribution, it's marketing, right? So I made sure this time around that I asked them to, do public relations and marketing, which they did, which has made a big difference. So that's the difference. I mean, anybody can publish their own book or go through a publisher to get a book published, but if the publisher doesn't do anything to support it, it's not going to go anywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, and we've got another question. Yeah, really good question. What would you recommend to people, especially if they're very young authors, to write their story and publish it for young folks, part of the community?
Sure. Well, first of all, write. I mean, write if you love writing, write. I think it's the best advice. Don't worry about publishing. I mean, write. Just write. Get into the habit of writing, and yeah. I mean, and then it's a process, right? It's like really a process of. I can't remember long ago, but I remember writing to an author. And his advice to me, who was well published, his advice to me was, it started with, the first book that I wrote was rejected by 100 different publishers and agents, 100. Think about it. And that was back in the day when books were, so I mean, this is, it's not an easy game. So write what you love first and foremost, and then, and then try to have it published, but write what you love. There's another question. Go ahead.
Yeah. A question in the chat here. What do you see as some of the most pressing current issues for LGBTQI plus people?
Sure. Well, thank God the blood ban is gone. I mean, how many years and how many promises of the government to get rid of that did it take, right? So, I mean, that was excruciating, have to say. Thank God, finally, the federal government, because one thing we couldn't do when I brought in banning conversion therapy, we banned it under OHIP, basically. We banned it for everyone that was a minor, and then we delisted it from OHIP for adults, but we couldn't criminalize it. So only the federal government can criminalize it. So that's what they've done. So that's good. But, that took a long time too. I mean, what pressing needs right now, I think, particularly for non-binary and trans folk, and particularly for non-binary trans folk of color, particularly for trans women of color who are in sex trade work, the stats are horrific, right? I mean, first of all, in the States, by the way, they have the same stats we do. About 52% of trans or non-binary children try to kill themselves. Suicide is still higher in all 2S LGBTQ people than in straight people, especially in teens. And so mental health is a huge, and support. I always say, if you want to be an ally, be one, right? Just like stand up. If you hear a comment, I mean, we all work in different places that aren't necessarily as queer positive as we are. If you hear comments, don't let them go. Confront folk nicely, talk to them. I mean, we want to change hearts and minds here. I mean, I remember as a politician, we would go into high schools, age 15 in civics classes and say, what do you want to talk about? And one high school I went into, my EA was also queer at the time, and a publicist, columnist, journalist. And she was standing at the back of the classroom, and this is downtown Toronto, in the Toronto District School Board, with gay pride posters on the walls and a GSA. And the first question that came out of one of the kids' mouths, this was during the sex ed stuff, was, why are we teaching people that being homosexual is okay? I mean, we're not talking the 80s, 90s, 70s, 60s. We're talking, wow, like 7 years ago. So I ended up, and then a lot of the classroom agreed. And so guess what? I ended up doing what I just did in a whirlwind manner, because these were kids were from Christian parents or from Muslim parents. I ended up quoting scripture and did what I could with the Quran, phoned my friend El Farouk Kaki to, maybe you should go speak at this school. And also, remember looking at my EA at the back of the room, she was just like turning green. And I said, you do get we're in a bit of a bubble here, right? And this kind of work is so important. It's the going out into the community. It's the talking in the community where there isn't necessarily agreement, talking truth to power where there isn't necessarily agreement. That's the hard work of allyship. And that's the hard work that we all should be engaged in, because that's the work that saves lives. It literally saves lives, because I looked at the classroom and guess who wasn't taking part in this? We're the queer kids who were so obvious and who were just had their heads down, almost on their desks. And my silent prayer is just get through high school alive. Just get through high school alive, right? That should not be the way our schools are. And sadly, many of them are. So do the work. That's what we still need to do.
And just a note on that too, because I think sometimes when we think about doing the work, sometimes we think, oh, it's going to be like you're in it for the long haul. And sometimes that's the case. But, you mentioned conversion therapy there, and that, the federal government was the only body that could really criminalize it nationwide. And it was as early as 2019 during, the health study that they were doing of queer lived experiences where, I was in the room with a couple of my other colleagues, and, we were it was kind of our turn to come up and do some testimony on it. And we were asked about it. And I remember the chief, not the chief, but the chair of the committee at the time had made a comment that, we had determined that it was a provincial manor. And I remember kind of speaking up a little bit at that point, and my colleagues as well, and saying, this is a fraud, and, you have the power to do something about it. You just have to choose to do it. And within that, the report came out a couple months later where they had recommended as a part of their 23 recommendations to decriminalize. And then it became a government priority, very kind of swiftly. And so when you do kind of work in, activism and kind of take part in that political process, and I know that we weren't the only ones who had mentioned conversion therapy when we went to testify. A lot of people did that and took the opportunity. You take your voices to the table, and once it becomes public record, how can you really ignore it?
Yeah, I was there, by the way, when they introduced that bill, of course, because ours was the first in the country. And in part, we consulted with them about how to write it. But you should know that in committees, in the committee hearings for that bill, which was mine alone, and I finally got through over a lot of objection. At the committee hearings, the ones who testified against, many of them were psychologist associations. One of the clinics that closed immediately was, I can say it now, CAMH. For trans kids. I mean, when we were talking about conversion therapy in 2015, it was happening everywhere. And by conversion therapy, I mean making trans kids walk the gauntlet before they would be considered for any kind of medical help at all. So, I mean, but what was still going on, which we couldn't stop, was some of the stuff that was happening religiously behind closed doors. So again, speak up. Like if you hear of somebody doing this, speak up, because a law is only as good as its enforcement. And I kept hearing of cases still going on because people weren't speaking up. So speak up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, we've got a few more questions here and a little bit of time left in our evening, so we'll try to get through all the remaining questions here. What was the core decision you made in your life before being a politician that helped you to connect your personal queer situations from the part and apply them as a politician?
So being queer in politics, is that the gist of it?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I mean, I was the first LGBTQ critic ever at Queen's Park for anybody. Like they didn't have that role, right? So that was an honor, and there was always more to do. So and I remember. People forget that governments are small towns. Queen's Park, there's under 200 people there. Even on the Hill, there's 600 and something people. And you all are in committees together, you all work together. I mean, COVID has separated people a lot, but I mean, the reality is that, you know, conservatives would be able to come over and ask me questions. I remember Sam Oosterhoff, who's now the, you know, next in line to Lecce. You know, this is a very conservative kid who got elected at 19, homeschooled, you know, fundamentalist Christian background. He and I would be passing notes back and forth in the legislature debating scripture. You know, like to have conversations with people who don't agree with you is something that you learn to do in the political world, in the political theater. And it's something we should learn to do in our own lives, like with our families, with our friends, with co-workers. And so another question about what do you do in schools when they think gay is, you know, a bad word? Well, you talk to them, you know, you deal with it. You don't have to you don't have to attack them, but you know, see it as an educational consciousness raising moment, which has been gifted to you, and you get to maybe change somebody's mind. You know how brilliant that feels? I mean, yeah. I mean, I used to debate Michael Corrin all the time on same-sex marriage, and guess what? Now he's an ally. So there you go. So, I mean, anybody can change and anybody will change, but only if, you know, you meet the right person who maybe, you know, enlarges your view of reality. So be that person.
I love that story. And I love that about Sam Oosterhoff as well. Like you see, there's been, you know, some questionable stuff in the news and media, but, you know, I think that's still a terrific example of just, you know, when you have the ability to do that, and you've got to stretch your own character in a way, you have to, you know, find a way to speak to someone across whatever aisle it is, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Why the United Church? Did you consider any other denominations, and have you received any pushback from the United Church because of your activism?
No, I didn't consider any other denominations because in 1988, the United Church was the only mainline denomination that came out and would ordain openly gay and lesbian people. And even though at that point, when I first walked into a church, I didn't have a thought of being ordained. That wasn't even a dream of any sort. Just like political life, it's amazing where I end up. But that's why I wouldn't have walked into a church, and I wouldn't have taken my children to a church that wasn't inclusive. Now, were they completely and utterly inclusive? No, there's been a lot of work that's gone on since 1988. Witness that when I did the first legalized same-sex marriage, I said, okay, back me up here. And silence was a response from the denomination at that point, which again, I'm sure they've regretted since. There's lots and lots of affirming churches and inclusive churches now in the United Church. So them and Metropolitan Community Church are the only churches that I'm aware of now that will, are okay with legalized, in church weddings. Now, some Anglican priests will do it and are doing it, but as a, denomination, they didn't go in that direction. So, support people that support you is basically why I walked in there, and I don't regret it at all. No.
And speaking of the United Church, if anyone in York Region is looking for a church, we have a great partnership with Pflag, and I know other community partners as well with Richmond Hill United Church. They're in Richmond Hill. Yeah. And
Richmond Hill United Church was the very first church I walked into.
I thought so.
Because I lived in Richmond Hill at the time. It's the first church I walked into. Yeah, I used to have money. That's so sad to say. Yeah, I used to have money. I used to live in Bayview Hills development. I bought one of the houses there when it was brand new. Now I couldn't afford to buy it ever. Yeah. But that's when I had my business, and it was a success. But I walked in there, and I'm glad I did. So I'm glad to see they're still making it work.
Yeah. Great. All right, a couple more questions here, and I'm just going to reorder them because I think we can end on one of them with a really good message. So, do you have opportunity to engage conservative clergy? If so, what are the best strategies for engagement? And then I think this might tie in a little bit as well. I'm Catholic and very religious, but I'm also gay. What is your advice for me to start understanding the connection between religion and queer lives? So I guess navigating conversations with more conservative folks than really navigating that identity from within.
Yeah. Okay. So Ontario English Catholic Teachers, one of my best friends was involved, and many of them are queer. Guess what? Many of the teachers in the Catholic system are queer, and many priests. In fact, I saw a study, said almost 50% of priests are gay. Now, are they actively gay? Well, they're not supposed to be, right? I would say, first of all, find clergy that are support people who support you. Find a priest who supports you. Find a priest who doesn't lecture you. Find a priest who is there to love you, which is what their call is, and do that. And remember, it's your church, not just their church. I've had this conversation with many Catholic theologians and clergy. It's your church, right? So see it as your church. It's my church, my right to be there, my right to take the sacrament, my right to pray there, my right to attend, and guess what? I'm queer. So I'm queer and I'm here. Get over it, right? So really, hold yourself in as much esteem as you hold those in power around you, because you are worth it. And quite frankly, that's as Christian as it gets. You're made in God's image. You are. And guess what? We have a trans God. Oldest Genesis passage, God made male and female in God's image. So there you go. And remember these texts of terror. There are other ways of reading them, as I've kind of given you the 2-cent version. But yeah, so begin those conversations, and don't forget that you are made in the image of God, that you're beautiful and you're beloved, and you're created exactly as you should be, right? And that goes if you're trans and non-binary too, by the way. So don't go into this, biological fundamentalism either.
Where can we buy the book?
Pretty much at anywhere, and you can get it on Amazon, blah, blah. But I always suggest support your local bookstores, or go to your library and ask them if they don't have it on their shelves to order it in, because that way everybody gets to have access to it. So your library or your local bookstore, Glad Day has it, Another Story bookstore has it downtown, but if there's a bookstore close to you that's local, please, ask them to order it in, they will, or go to your library and just say, I'd really like to have this book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I got mine at Glad Day Bookshop, and we at Pflag will always try to direct folks over to Glad Day. They're the longest running bookstore, queer bookstore in history in the world. So and they're here in Toronto. So highly recommend supporting them if you can. But you can always get it wherever is convenient for you.
Absolutely.
And I think the last question here, I know there's a couple coming in. Sorry, we'll probably won't be able to get to everyone, but I'm already wheels are turning just for another event. I'm just going to put that out there anyways. But what is the best advice you could give to young queer leaders to start their political careers and get involved in activism and queer political leadership?
Sure. So the best way to get involved in the political process is to volunteer for a politician. It's the very, very best way. So that you've got a provincial campaign coming up very soon in June 2nd. You've got federal ones, municipal ones coming up in the future too. Find a politician that you admire, get involved in working on their campaign. That's almost always, of course, volunteer. But guess what? It's the ardent volunteers that get looked at for positions as they come up. The other ways of going about it is, if you're in university, there are internship programs you can apply for, both federally and provincially. So you can do that. But yeah, volunteer, this has been true ever since I used to be in the headhunting business, but volunteer for the job that you want to get paid for, in a sense, right? Or certainly in the place you want to get paid for the job that you ultimately want to get, right? So get as close to the job as you can. And I know we all need to work for a living, as well as, and make some money as well as volunteer. But starting with the campaign is the best intro to what political life is like. And get to know the people who are your representatives. Don't wait for the campaign to do that. You have an MPP, you've got an MP, you've got a councillor. Get to know these folk. They want to know you. You're a voter, right? So try to speak to them about issues that concern you, and so that they will know you. And trust me, I knew our activists in my riding. knew all of them. I knew the ones that would come forward to the mic at all candidates meetings. I knew the ones that would be there, even if they agreed with me or not. I knew the ones who were going to stand up for issues, right? So be that person.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us here tonight, Cheri, and thank you all for attending. There's so many questions and a lot of great engagement, so thank you for joining us. And I can tell you're popular. I knew you're popular before, but I'm already thinking like we could do something on like the texts of terror, like break them down. How do you,
sure.
you know, object them?
Absolutely.
Like, that
Happy
sounds
to do
great.
that.
All
Happy
right.
to do that. And anyway, just remember this. You're beautiful, you're loved, you're absolutely made the way and created the way you should be. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Stand up, represent. Thanks so much, everybody. And happy Day of Pink.
Yep, happy Day
Bye,
of Pink.
guys.
Thank you all for attending. Have a great night.